Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Naomi Schaefer Riley, a visiting fellow here who's been focusing on child welfare issues. This event today, Reforming Foster Care at the State Level, is part of our continuing effort here to examine issues that are concerning struggling Americans. I am deeply heartened to see so many of you here to discuss this important topic today. I want to tell you a little bit about it and introduce our speaker. The Department of Health and Human Services recently reported that the number of children in foster care at the end of fiscal year 2016 increased to over 437,000 from 427,000 reported at the end of the previous year. This is continuing an upward trend for the last several years. Of the 15 categories states can report for the circumstances associated with a child's removal from the home and placement into care, drug abuse by a parent had the largest percentage increase. Approximately 92,000 children were removed from their home in 2016 because at least one parent had a drug abuse issue. The effect of the opioid crisis on foster care is one of the many issues that we hope to cover this afternoon. And I can think of no better group of people than the ones assembled today to help us understand what's going on in the lives of our nation's most vulnerable children. Our first speaker today is Matt Bevin, who was elected governor of Kentucky in 2015. Governor Bevin attended Washington and Lee University, and upon graduation served as on active duty as a U.S. Army officer, leaving the service having achieved the rank of captain. In 2011, he became president of Bevin Brothers, a small bell manufacturing company founded in 1832, and a family business for 6 generations. Governor Bevin made foster care reform a platform of his election campaign, and he has continued to speak out about the issue and enact policy changes in this area since coming into office. Following Governor Bevin's address, he and I will have a Q&A session, and then we will have some questions from the audience as well. After that, I will introduce our panel of distinguished guests to discuss this topic. They will offer some reactions to Governor Bevin's remarks, as well as their own proposal for improving the foster care landscape. Thank you so much for coming again, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to the governor for his remarks. Please welcome him.
Thank you all for being here. It's a beautiful day out there. You could have been a lot of places. You chose to be in here. Thanks for having a heart for this. Thank you for caring about this. I'll tell you straight up, if you're looking to get all the right answers for everything as it relates to foster care and adoption, I am not the person that's going to give you every perfect solution. And frankly, there is no such person. There is no ability to, with a single piece of legislation, regulation, or just even wishful thinking, fix what ails this process. But here's the bottom line. We can make it a whole lot better. I'll just give you a little bit of background as some of my passion on this. My wife and I happen to have 9 children, so we already have a little more experience with kids than the average family, perhaps. We had 5 children. We adopted 4 additional children, so we did this to ourselves on purpose. There's really nobody to blame but ourselves for this. I have 7 teenagers right now, so including 6 teenage daughters at my house right now. So that's why I'm here with you, actually. You think I'm kidding? I'm not. No, just kidding. The bottom line is this. Years ago, we actually, before we had adopted, we tried to adopt a young girl out of the foster care system in Kentucky. And after many, many, many months, well over a year of back and forth and filling out paperwork and getting fingerprinted again, and even though they all go to the ultimate same database, submitting thing after thing after thing, getting home inspections, having our children interviewed, taking classes and having to take them together, taking parenting classes, sometimes being taught by people who didn't even have children, teaching my wife and I with 5 children how to be parents. Just a lot of things, a lot of bureaucracy, all with good intent. None of this being done with bad intent. At the end of it all being done, it was determined by somebody for reasons that to this day there really seem to be no real logic behind or legal reason for. It was decided after more than a year of this that, you know what, you already have 5 children, that's enough. We don't think that it would be appropriate for this girl, and she was an 11-year-old who had been in more than a dozen homes, had never had a home, wasn't likely to be adopted by anybody. She was 11 years old. And they said it will be better for her to stay in the system than to be the sixth child in a family because she won't get enough attention. Literally. This was years and years ago. This young girl is an adult somewhere now. It truly breaks my heart to imagine the trajectory of her life so different than it might have been. And I had nothing to do with politics. Even now, this is the first political job that I've ever had. I'm 2 years into it. Never worked for a politician. I didn't study political science. So I don't come at this with some kind of political perspective. But I look at something like that, and even then, I just remember being struck by the fact that this system is not working properly. Something's broken. And why? Because it seemed at every turn to be taking care of a whole lot of constituencies, a whole lot of rules, a whole lot of regulations, a whole lot of processes, but it wasn't taking care of the kids. And I would submit to you, during the course of our conversation, and the reflection that you have afterwards, the entire system, this isn't unique to Kentucky. It's every system, in every state. We are not taking care of the children. We're not listening to the children. Ultimately, we ended up adopting, 4 more children. First one, and then a family sibling group of 3 others that were, all together. The oldest was 10. Most people don't want to adopt 3 children at once. They don't want to adopt older children. But as we've often said, once you have 6, really, what's the difference? 6, 9, whatever. So we went from 5 to 6, and then 6 to 9. And guess what? They've all gotten attention. They've all gotten love. We haven't lost one yet, for extended periods of time anyway. So the point is this. Every situation is different. Not every family could or should have 9 kids. But the reality is this. The kids should come first, and the interests of the kids should come first. So some of the things that we've been doing in Kentucky is just focusing attention on it. The key is to get the right people at the table and really listen to them, including the children in the foster care system. So my wife, who has a passion and a heart for this, she's a nurse by training, but a mother by profession, and a saint by a higher power than me. She's an amazing woman. She has a heart for young people. And she said, listen, I want to hear from the children. I want to gather the kids and get their voices. And so we've been able to move policy because there's nothing more powerful than a young person learning how the process works. And then a foster kid coming into a legislative chamber, into a committee hearing, and into a full chamber and making the case for why something as simple as why foster kids can't get driver's licenses should be evaluated and changed. And the kids who are 16 years old and don't have a parent approval because the parent might be in prison, the parent might be unwilling to be engaged, the parent might be unknown, but because that child has no parental approval, they can't get a driver's license. Simple things like that. You think, how is there something that precludes that? Well, there was. But guess where those ideas came from? They came from the children that are affected. So guess what? Now children in Kentucky can get a driver's license when they're above 16. It should have been simple to do, but it took a legislative effort. Fictive kin. Realizing that sometimes, while the child may not be best served in their family environment, and we'll get to that perhaps during the course of some of our conversation, there might be a trusted coach, there might be a teacher, there might be a neighbor that could be an extended member of that child's family to take that child in. These are the kind of things that, again, we've now begun to address legislatively. But the bottom line is this, and this is a challenge to all of you who have influence on this, who have thoughts on this, who have the ear of the judiciary at any level on this. We have a problem, I think, in a lot of places in America, wondering who should be served first. There are literally, and this is, I don't mean to digress, but there are still states in America where if a child is conceived by rape, that the father, by law, has parental rights of that child and has the right to visitation and the right to, that's crazy. It doesn't matter which states, there's a few of them left. But these are the kind of things that still exist because somehow, somewhere, maybe nobody thought to get the priority straight. So it goes back to whose services should be looked out for first, whose life should be looked out first, the child, period. This idea that the family is always the best is not good. I would beg to differ. I don't think that's necessarily true. Sometimes the family is best. Sometimes the worst thing for that child is to be in that family or an extended part of that family. We need to be honest about it. And so this takes our courts understanding that this idea of reunification, while great in theory, may not really be what's best. These are things that, again, I encourage you to challenge notions that are sort of preconceived as being the way things have always been and the way they should be. So we're making a lot of changes. We're listening. I'm convinced of the fact. I'll tell you a couple of facts, and then I'll sit down and we can have further dialogue. 8,500 children in the foster care system in Kentucky. That number, despite all the efforts we've been making, has actually been increasing, largely because of the opioid epidemic. And we could talk about that. It's had a direct impact. 70% of the children in our foster care system are in that foster care system because at least one of their parents has a substance use disorder. That's a harsh reality. But we have about 2,400 children out of those 8,500 that are fully eligible to be adopted, who want to be adopted. And it takes, on average, almost 3 years for a child who's able and willing to be adopted to make their way through the bureaucracy that exists. That's a problem. And again, I'd submit it's not just Kentucky. Some states are better, some states worse. But it shouldn't be that reality. So those are my goal is this. I want to see these numbers removed. There's always going to be some children in the foster care system. There are. But it shouldn't be 8,500. It should be some fraction of that. And for the children that are eligible to be adopted, it should be a very small number. It should be a fraction of the 2,400. Last thing I'll say before I sit down. This is what I challenge you all with. You got to make people aware of these situations. Numbers matter. Statistics matter. That's true. But people matter. Faces matter. Real stories matter. When I did my State of the Commonwealth address some weeks ago, I spoke on this topic. But for the first time, apparently, in the history of Kentucky, as part of the State of the Commonwealth address, I had an audio-visual board. I had boards about the size of these. And on these boards, I put pictures a couple of times as I was speaking. When I spoke on this issue, I put a picture up on the board. It was a picture of a mother and a father and 3 young children. They all had their backs to the camera. They were all wearing T-shirts. On the back of their T-shirts were numbers. That's all it had, numbers. The mom and dad had the same number, 1,291, I believe, was the number. The children had other numbers, between 600 and something and 1,000 and something. Then I explained to people what those numbers were. That was how long each one of those people, from the moment that they either tried to find a permanent family or the time they tried to find a child to be a part of their permanent family, that it took them to make their way through the system. The average number was somewhere north of 1,000. That's crazy. It's utterly irresponsible on the part of us in government who have the ability to do something about it. But then I invited that family in so that they weren't just a number. They weren't just a picture. They came in. And then I did something else that was unconventional. And I say this to you only to challenge you in your respective roles. I don't know who you all are. I don't know what each of your daily responsibilities are. But don't be conventional. If you need to solve something, don't always use the conventional things that have been done before, because that's why we keep getting similar results. I brought this family in. I had them come up and they joined me on the podium in front of the entire assembled legislature in the House chambers. And they stood there, and needless to say, 3 squirming little kids made an interesting photo op for a whole lot of the journalists that were there. And I ended up taking one of these little children from the mom who took the podium, and I said, why don't you tell people what you want them to hear? This young woman was a professional. She was a school teacher. Her husband was a professional. They were a squared-away young couple. And the one little guy that I was holding literally starts pulling his shirt up for everybody, and I quickly pulled his little shirt back down again. But again, what was powerful about this? Do you think for 1 second, you watch what's now House Bill number 1 in Kentucky. Scribble down House Bill 1, Kentucky. Make a point of going back and watching this. You can look it up now. It's making its way through the legislature. You watch how that transforms what we do in Kentucky. Do you think my odds of getting that through the legislature went up or down based on the personalization of this issue? It went through the roof. There's not one legislator that is going to look at that bill and not be reminded of those children and of that couple. I ask you to personalize this issue. I ask you to take it to a whole nother level of earnestness and of conviction on your part. If you care about this, and I'll tell you, there's millions of children in America who need us to get this right. Have a sense of urgency, the likes of which perhaps you've never had, and demand of people like me in your respective states, of your congressional leaders, of your state leaders, of your local leaders, demand of them that they take action and make changes. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I appreciate the chance to sit down and have further dialogue on a couple of fronts. And I look forward to any questions from you all as well as time allows. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Bevin, for those remarks.
You're welcome.
I wanted to start by digging down a little bit into the specifics. I saw that in your new budget, you've allotted $24 million to hire more social workers in the Child Protective Services realm. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Do you think that the problems that we're experiencing in this bureaucracy you describe are the result of a workforce that is too small? Do you think that this workforce is being trained properly? And do you think that they're attracting the right people? How do you kind of look at this bureaucracy and think about changing it?
Yes, no, maybe, yes, and no. No, I'm just kidding. I really don't stick those answers to those questions because I really don't remember the exact order. But in general, here's why I put $24 million into this budget. In every state, everywhere, this is an underfunded area. It just is. Which isn't to say that money is the solution. It isn't just a money thing. Social workers are historically not well paid. But you know what? They didn't go into this for the money. The people who go into social work most often do it because they have a true passion and a calling to that. But we historically, I've already raised pay for our social workers once, and I've been governor for 2 years now. And I did it because they've just been so low paid that turnover becomes a problem. And for those of you who've ever worked in business, the cost of turnover is higher than the cost of a pay increase. Just is, at a certain point. And so some of it's just practical business sense. But what I made clear when I put that $24 million in there is that that would afford us the ability to hire additional caseworkers because we have a very high caseload. You want to get those down. Why? So that people aren't overworked? Partially. But frankly, you want to get them down so that they can be adjudicated, so these things can be settled, so that kids can get adopted, and so children who need to be removed can be removed, and people who need to be reunified can be reunified. And that doesn't happen when those cases are somewhere deep in a pile on somebody's desk. So part of it was a recognition that we want to get more people and we want to get more pay for those people that would range between 10 and 20%. However, I made very clear, none of these pay raises are going to take effect until the next fiscal year, which would start July 1. And between now and then, I intend to get the right people in the right seats on the bus. You all are thinkers. You've probably perhaps read a book that came out 15, 20 years ago called Good to Great by a guy named Jim Collins. In there's a chapter about not just getting the right people on the bus, you got to get the right people in the right seats on the bus, which gets to your question about training and things of this sort. If we don't have the right people in the right seats on the bus, we're not going to be as effective as we could be. And so to that end, I think what's critical is to make sure that these dollars go to people who are in those right seats, that the supervisors are worthy of being supervisors, and that the employees are worthy of having the responsibility of these caseloads. What's interesting is that part of the turnover comes from the fact that good people come in and get burned out. And the people who aren't as good or effective or don't care as much seem to stick around, and then eventually make their way up, and sometimes they are now the supervisors. And the net result of that is the good people just go crazy and they leave. So I think it is money, it is more bodies, it is training, but it's getting the right people in the right seats. That's how it's this topic and every other one as well.
Related to that, you made some remarks about the need to move children who are in these, I don't want to mischaracterize, but temporary situations,
foster care type situations,
make them available for adoption if the return to a permanent family is not going to happen. This week the Arizona legislature is debating a bill that will if passed, a move to terminate parental rights sooner in cases where children have been born substance exposed. Obviously, the opioids are the big thing on people's minds, but any illegal drug. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this, whether you think that we're not doing enough, particularly with these children under the age of 1 or 2.
Yeah, we've seen a surge in children coming into our foster care system. We've seen a surge in 40% for what we would call newborns, literally at the moment of birth, children coming into the foster care system. That's increased by 40%. Toddlers, kind of, infancy up to, 2-3 years, is increased by 10% just in the last couple of years. So we're seeing surges in these young children. Back to the point of birth itself and a birth to somebody who's substance abused. Intuitively, instinctively, we would all say, absolutely. I mean, you'd kind of think, why wouldn't you? If a person is chosen, and I will tell you this, let me back up. If you don't intuitively and instinctively say that, you've never been in a NICU and seen a child going through withdrawal, it is one of the most horrific things you will ever see, even if you don't have any connection to that child. My wife used to be a labor and delivery nurse. I've seen this firsthand. It is horrific. It is the most torturous, horrific thing you have ever seen, with a child screaming, despite best efforts medically, to relieve that child's suffering, in just sheer tortured pain through no fault of their own. And you think anybody who would bring a child into the world in this instance does not deserve the right or responsibility of raising that child, would seemingly be the instinctive response and not necessarily a wrong response. But to the heart of your question, Naomi, you have to always think about unintended consequences as well. You just do. And so to that end, think about this. There is a state near our own, doesn't matter which one, that has similar type policies. So what happens? A couple of things happen. Young women in that state may be less likely to get prenatal care because they know that if they're identified as being a drug user, that they might go into the system and that someone might take their child away. I will say this, very few people that are addicted to drugs want to be addicted to drugs. Like almost none, pretty much. So to that end, they might in moments of clarity realize this is a slope I don't want to get on. And so guess what's been interesting since these policies have gone in place in this state? We've seen a lot of these women coming to Kentucky to give birth. So now they become a burden on our state financially, and that's an unintended consequence of this as well. But then by not getting prenatal care, by not getting the ability to have somebody intercede on their behalf, you end up creating potentially a different pattern that has more daunting consequences than if this didn't exist. So it's not as simple as just A equals B. But I am a believer that we should look closely at some variations of that type of policy, because if we don't send a powerful enough message that it's unacceptable to abuse another person chemically in this way and not have some kind of consequence. If a person did anything even remotely related to one of their children that was as horrific and as painful and had as long-term consequences as some of this does as it relates to the literal wiring, the neurology of that child and the impairment as a result of being born drug addicted. If they did anything even remotely close to any of that, after that child was born, that child would be taken away in a heartbeat and not returned to them. So we're foolish if we don't at least consider it as part of any policies, but these things should be done legislatively because every state is different. And the people's voice should be heard.
I wanted to turn to some federal legislation that recently passed, the Family First Act. After a couple of years of back and forth, a few weeks ago, it was passed. It allows for states to be reimbursed for preventive services that might prevent the need for children to enter foster care in the first place. I was wondering if you could describe any of the prevention efforts you're seeing in Kentucky and whether you think that this will be a game changer or just sort of a minor blip on the screen in terms of fixing your problem.
This is a great question, and these are all parts of a solution. Again, there is no perfect solution. And there is no one thing that is going to be that solution, even in its imperfect state. But this is an important thing. As you were asking me, this circling a couple of things on here. I'm going to read these. Everything has an acronym, especially if it involves federal funding. So this reminds me of two particular programs. One's called K-STEP, the other one's called START. K-STEP stands for Kentucky Strengthening Ties and Empowering Parents. K-STEP. And this is such a program where we could use Title IV-E dollars that would be more readily available to us in waiver format, what have you, for this purpose. So could it be a part of a solution? Yes. Why? Because it would empower us as states to be more thoughtful, to be specific to needs within our state. So yes, it could be. The other one is called START, which is, and this gets to the point you were asking about kind of front end, kind of interceding early type thing. It stands for START, is the acronym. It stands for Sobriety, Treatment, and Recovery Teams. So again, everything has a cute acronym to it. So what is that? Sobriety, treatment, and recovery teams. You intercede early. You find those moms that are addicted. You find those homes where a child is under a certain age. And specifically, these dollars would allow us, in certain instances, with certain criteria, in a home where there's a child under the age of 6, in a home where there's a history of drug abuse, where there's a concern that there is that drug abuse relating to neglect of some sort, could be physical, could be emotional, could be psychological, could be sexual. But the bottom line is when there are warning signs, these programs like this allow us to intercede early, to try to get in there at the front end and to make a difference before it does ultimately affect that child in even more detrimental ways. And so the ability to utilize these monies, again, is not a cure-all, but could be very, very helpful to us in this instance.
Just one last question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. You mentioned that there, for many years now, has been a kinship preference in terms of placement of children when there is a need to remove them from their home. I was wondering if you could talk about that. Do you think that the pendulum has swung too far in the direction of kinship placement? There's a lot of debate about this issue now. Do you think that we're too quick to look for extended family when it's possible that they're experiencing the same kind of problems that the nuclear family is?
That I'm very comfortable saying the answers to are yes, yes, and yes, or at least yes and yes. Family isn't always the best solution. It just isn't. I remember some years ago, this is many years ago, my wife's mother was fostering some children. This is after all her kids were long grown, and this was literally just 10 years ago. There was a little boy, his name was Nate. This kid had been so horrifically and repeatedly abused, physically and sexually, by his own parents. They would put cigarette butts out on this kid. They would put him in the backyard with a dog that they knew would chew on him. And the court system returned this child to those parents multiple times, knowing these things, having documented and proven these things, having taken the child away from these parents because of these things. And yet some judge, perhaps because they didn't focus on what was really going on, perhaps they were too busy, perhaps the rules told them they had to do it as a matter of first recourse, put this child back in. When I first met Nate, he was about 6. And he was a sweet, sweet kid. A really sweet kid. He had been born chemically dependent in a way that truly did alter his wiring. So he was always going to have an uphill slug. But you put that together with this systematic abuse at the hands of his own biological parents, and it ruined him. The last I knew, when he was about probably 15, they were no longer able to take care of him through a fostering situation. And he was institutionalized because he'd been robbed of his actual humanity. There's no excuse for that. It should never have been allowed to happen. Too much of that happens through nobody's initial intent, as I said earlier, but because we don't intentionally make sure that that doesn't happen. The idea of finding extended family members. I could give you another case that I won't give you the specifics on, other than to say that there was an instance just like this happened just recently in Kentucky. And I'll tell you what, the system went out of its way to find an aunt who's addicted to drugs, who has a multitude of strange men rotating through that woman's life on short-term basis, no ability to care for herself already, entirely on entitlement programs from the government, who is now the guardian of this child who's a distant relative. That's ridiculous. And everybody tells me their hands were tied. These are the kind of things that I want to see changed. Because that child will not be better because they're with a family member. That family member often, not always, but often, is found to be somebody with equal or worse problems than the part of the family, to the heart of your second part of your question, that this child was taken from. It's very rare that in isolation there's a very abusive part of a family. It's often systemic. The vast majority of the children in our prison system, in our foster care system, etc., grew up with a parent that was either incarcerated or grew up in a foster system, etc. There's a correlation to these things. And so it's important for us to always put the child first, period. What's best for that child, if that child wants to be reconciled with family when they become an adult, that child should have that absolute legal right. And the state should make available to that child information necessary for them to be able to do that if they want as an adult. But recently we had another child ripped from a family that was the only family this child had known for 2 years. 2.5, almost 3 years. This child knew their mom and dad. And this child was taken out of that family and put with an extended family member who suddenly was now back in the picture. And this family member is now going to get money for raising this child, and that was part of the impetus for this person reappearing on the scene. That child's life will not be what that child's life was or could have been. Again, challenge the status quo, because nothing's going to change if we don't.
I'd like to now open it up for some questions. If you could stand up and wait for a microphone to come to you, please identify yourself, and we kindly request that you ask questions and not make statements. So. Lady back here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Evan Davies, and I'm just an independent consultant. I'm not affiliated with any organization. I really admire the work that you're doing to help foster children, and you've said a number of times that the children's lives is most important. We had a murder a little while ago where 17 people, including many kids, were murdered in their schools. And how do you reconcile the children's lives are most important with the comments you've made to the media about it's naive and premature to talk about gun control, and that it's culture and not guns that is causing these horrible things?
I'll tell you exactly how I reconcile that. First of all, a month ago in Kentucky, we had a very similar situation. Made a very concerted effort to make sure that we removed the media circus from the healing process. So within 24 to 48 hours, you're probably not even aware, most people aren't, that I had a 15-year-old come into a school in Kentucky last month and shoot 16 children at point-blank range, 2 of whom died. A set of twins were both shot and taken to a level 1 trauma center. They lived. This is very real to me. I've sat with these families. You also probably are not aware of the fact that I buried my oldest child. Died under different circumstances, but went to school and didn't come home. She was 17 years old. I know exactly, not exactly, it's not possible to know exactly what another person's going through, but I know exactly what it feels like to bury your oldest child. I know what the impact is on a family. I don't come at this with a sense of sympathy, but empathy. The point that I've made that's been largely misconstrued, I'll reaffirm with you and tell you exactly where it comes from. This idea, just as solving this issue is able to be solved with a single law or rule or change, is naive and delusional. And so we shouldn't allow ourselves to entertain naive and delusional thoughts. It is part of a broader construct, just as this issue is. And the point that I made, that I'll reiterate, is that if we think that a part of what we are seeing is not a cultural problem, we're kidding ourselves. And the point that I've made is this. What has shifted in the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years? It's not the percentage of guns that we find in homes. And you can give me a statistic that there's now more guns. Fair enough, I'll submit that that may be true. I'm not going to argue with you. But the reality is there's fewer homes that have guns in them than there were 50 years ago when children didn't walk into schools and shoot themselves and shoot each other. That's a fact. You can confirm that. But I'll tell you this. When I was a kid, kids brought guns to school. Kids brought guns on the school bus. Kids brought guns to school in their own vehicles. Kids didn't shoot each other with them. So some things have not changed. What has changed? We as a culture, as a society, and it's very germane to this topic as well, we don't value human life like we did. We remove increasingly respect for the dignity of other people. You look at how rampant pornography is, the degradation and disrespect for women and for human life in general. It is so systemic. People of our age have not been exposed like our children have been. There's not a child in America that hasn't been exposed to pornography, I guarantee you, if they're above the age of 12. That's a fact. It is so systemic, it's horrific. And it desensitizes us at every turn. And so we're desensitized to the value and dignity of human life. We're desensitized through, and this is to the heart of what I said that you seem to take exception with, is that through violent video games, where literally you are encouraged, and you can roll your eyes all you want, man, but I will say this. You explain to me the value of a game that encourages somebody to go back and finish him off, where you get points for kill counts, and you slaughter people. We're desensitizing people to the value of life. And we see it through the lyrics and music, and we see it through television shows, and we see it through movies. We see it in the fact that the mores of this nation have changed. And we see it through the fact that we increasingly want to remove any sense of moral authority from everything. I'll tell you again, we could have 1,000 sidebars, and you could agree or disagree as it relates to what I'm about to say. But in a nation where over the last 40 years, we've aborted 50-something million children, and we have multiple states with medically assisted suicide being provided by doctors. At both ends of the life spectrum, we're losing the value for life that we once historically had. You can say that's good, you can say it's bad, but it's a reality. You couple that with the fact that all these other things are changing, that we're removing any sense of authority. It used to be that you had different levels of authority starting in the home itself. Fully a third of children in a recent Pew study say that they have no interaction, for all intents and purposes, with their own parents. When their parents live in the home, they say their parents have no clue what they're even learning in school. There was a study recently and an article that was derived from that and other studies. It was in the Atlantic. I encourage you to look it up, about the impact. And again, you can smirk and you can smile, but as somebody who's an independent consultant, I find it remarkable that you're so smug and you're so disregarding of my opinion, when in fact I'm just trying to have an honest dialogue with you, based on a fair question. But I will say this. Look at this article in the Atlantic. This article in the Atlantic talks about how young people are increasingly becoming suicidal and depressed because of the use of social media and the use of these personal devices and on-screen time. All these are part of a cultural issue. In this cultural issue, if we're not addressing it, we are kidding ourselves, because it also affects this issue we came here to talk about today, which is why these homes are broken, why so many children are finding themselves in government care, which is not the best solution. The government should not be raising our children, period. It just shouldn't. The fact of the matter is we need people in the position like I am. And I had this same conversation less than an hour ago with the President of the United States. And I said to him, he should, I should. This whole room was full of cabinet secretaries and governors of other states. Those of us that are in a position of influence and the ability to say something, shame on us if we don't step up and call people to a higher authority. And there will always be those, including many in the media, whoever the messenger is, they're going to find the imperfection in that messenger. So if the messenger says we should do X, Y, Z as it relates to this issue or adoption and foster care, People will say, well, who is this person? They're an imperfect person. Well, so is every one of us. There's not a perfect person in America, but that doesn't mean we don't strive for perfection. There's not a perfectly morally upright person in America. That doesn't mean we don't espouse and aspire to reach for moral higher authority and expect more and demand more of our children. Shame on us if we don't sound the alarm. You want to take any kind of morality and change the mores of a nation, remove any sense of higher responsibility, try to pin it on any one thing and assume the government and a piece of regulation and a rule is the solution, and then we're shocked when these things happen, we're kidding ourselves. Yes, sir.
Oh, we'll take one more question before we have to cut off.
I'll give you a shorter answer.
Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals. Could you talk a bit about what churches in Kentucky are doing to respond to these problems, and what more could we be doing?
Here's what I'd say to both houses of faith and those that are not, but have good intentions. I think we are not even beginning to tap into the millions of people that want to be part of the solution. We have about 6,500 houses of worship in Kentucky. I've got 2,400 children waiting for a home. It's unfathomable for me to imagine that I can't find one home out of every 2 to 3 churches in Kentucky that would be willing to have one family in 1 out of 3 churches that would take a child in and adopt them. I know for a fact it's possible. The key is connecting the dots. So the question specifically is, what are we doing? We're starting to connect those dots. They've never historically been. We've had people operating in silos, and again, there's so many different groups, some perhaps represented by many of you in this room, who have absolute good intention, but ironically are operating independent of one another. Even though maybe you're pursuing the very same desire and same mission, maybe with a slightly different variation on what the method to the madness might be, but nonetheless wanting the same end goal. So what we are starting to do is build basically consortiums, and we're doing it through face-to-face regular dialogue. We're inviting folks like you and others with different perspective to the table physically, eye-to-eye, face-to-face, sitting around. We're working with outside groups. Whether it's Wendy's Wonderful Kids, whether it's the Casey Family Foundation, whether it's the Annie Casey Foundation, whether it's, name them. There's a number of groups out there. Focus on the family. A lot of people who have a passion and a heart for this. And so we're bringing them to the table. We're the only state in America, I believe, and I think the only one ever, where both the Casey Foundations have operated in the same state at the same time. They don't always do that. In fact, they don't do it. I'm also, sadly, the only governor that's ever met with both of them. My wife is the only first lady, or at least the second first lady to ever meet with them. My point being is that people like us don't talk to people like you. You're the solution more than any government idea is the solution. Because the greatness of America is that ideas come from the people. And they come up through the system. And we have the ability of and by and for the people to solve a whole lot of things. So what we're doing in Kentucky, and what I'm encouraging others to do as well, is to build collaborative efforts. We've started something called Open Hearts, Open Homes, specifically, where we ask people from the faith-based community in this instance to come, hear the case, understand what is the process, and then we get them on an expedited, handheld path toward getting qualified as foster parents and being able to be adoptive parents. These are the kind of things that we're doing, and we're at the front end. Again, I'm 2 years into this. It's a big issue, but I will close with this comment. You wouldn't want to be in the foster care system anywhere in America, because frankly it means you don't have the kind of stable home that every one of us would want to have and most of us were blessed to have. But I do mean this sincerely, that if you're going to be a foster kid anywhere in America, you're going to wish you were in Kentucky by the time I'm done. That's my goal. Without vision, the people will perish. True enough. It's as old as time. It's truism. It can be almost to the point of being trite. But my vision is that we come up with a solution, working with partners, where we find a way to expedite a child to a permanent, stable, loving, safe, instructive environment. That's all a kid needs. That's all a kid wants. Won't make them perfect. Won't mean the home is perfect. Won't mean they'll turn out perfect. But the reality is, it gives them a much better odds of actually getting on target. Thank you.
We're going to have like a 2-minute break where we just bring up some more chairs and our panelists. So if you could all remain seated, the governor is going to leave, and then we will quickly move on to the next section of our program. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all. And again, thanks for caring about this.
I think they're going to put up. All set? All right, I think we're going to move on to the next. We're running a couple minutes late, so we're going to move on to the next part of our program. We are so fortunate to have with us three experts who, among them, probably know all of what there is to know about today's topic. I want to introduce each of them briefly, and then I will turn it over to them for some remarks and some conversation. And at 1:45, we're going to start to take another round of questions from the audience. So our first guest is Jerry Milner. He is the Associate Commissioner at the Children's Bureau and the Acting Commissioner for the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families. Before joining the Trump administration at ACF, he served as the Vice President for Child Welfare Practice at the Center for the Support of Families, and he formerly served as State Child Welfare Director in Alabama. Our second panelist, I'm just going to do this all once so I don't have to come back up here. Ronald Richter is the CEO of JCCA, one of New York's largest providers of children and family services. He has served as New York State Family Court Judge and as the Commissioner of the New York City Administration for Children's Services during the Bloomberg administration. And our final guest is Robin Wilson. She is the Roger and Stephanie Jocelyn Professor of Law at the University of Illinois College of Law, where she directs the College of Law's Family Law and Policy Program and the Epstein Health Law and Policy Program. She's a member of the American Law Institute, and she was elected in 2014 to the Executive Council of the International Society of Family Law. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Commissioner Milner to give us some brief remarks, and then we'll move on.
Sure. Yeah, you can hear me, I believe. I wasn't sure this thing was going to kick in or not. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you. I don't know who you are or where you're from, and so I'm not sure what I have to say is going to resonate, but I hope that it does. I just want to start out by saying when we're talking about foster care, and I've spent my life dealing with foster care, child protection. I've carried the caseloads, supervised the social workers. I am a social worker, and I'm very happy about that. But a few things that I've come to realize over the years is that when we're talking about strengthening the foster care system, I think we have to look beyond the foster care system itself to the reasons that children out there need foster care to begin with. I often say that I look at the news clippings every single day, and there's not a single day that some state's not begging for more foster homes to care for the children that are coming into care. And I'm sure that is a legitimate need. But I'm also convinced that more foster homes are not going to solve the problems that we're dealing with in our public child welfare system, particularly in our foster care system. The message that, if you don't remember anything else that I have to say here today, is that in order to really address foster care, we have a responsibility as a system, and I would say a moral and ethical responsibility, to help families either regain or hold on to the protective capacities that they have that lead them and their children into our child welfare system in the first place. We talk about prevention so often in terms of preventing the reoccurrence of maltreatment after the damage has been done. And you heard the governor talk about some of the most egregious examples that any of us want to hear about in terms of the trauma that's inflicted upon children through abuse and neglect in their lives. It's nearly impossible to fix that level of trauma after it's occurred. Yet in child welfare, and I say this as somebody who has devoted my life to child welfare, we're as committed as any social institution that we have to intervening only after the damage has been done. And I think we have to reimagine, we have to re-envision, we have to reconceptualize what we're trying to accomplish through this big system that we call child welfare. And I believe that it has to be the primary prevention of maltreatment through the strengthening of families and their capacity to care for their children in safe and appropriate ways. I also believe that has to happen at the community level, where children and parents actually live and can get access to the kinds of social supports, emotional supports, concrete needs, concrete services that could help them avoid falling into this child welfare ditch that we have out there that's often so very hard for them to come out of. The other panelists and I had an opportunity to chat just for a few minutes before we came up here, and we're sharing stories about some of the very effective programs out there that are doing that and have been in the business of doing that for quite some time. So that convinces me that we can have a system that both helps parents avoid the pitfalls of maltreatment, that avoids the trauma to children once that maltreatment has been inflicted, and for those most egregious situations, which we will always have and always have a need for, envisions a foster care system that is much more of a support for the family than it is a substitute. There are many situations, and don't in any way misinterpret what I'm saying, where children cannot and should not go back to their families. But I don't believe that that's the most typical situation. I believe that of the 437,000 children that we have in foster care right now, which by the way is a 10% increase over the last 5 years, many of those children, many of those families, if we had the opportunity to intervene earlier in their lives, before the report of maltreatment comes in, could have been helped to remain safely and in a healthy way with their own families. But at the same time, we do not fund our system to do that. We don't envision our system to do that, and we don't work with the many partners that are out there who, as the governor said, also are willing and are part of a much broader solution to addressing some of these many issues. I could clearly spend days going on and on about this because it's an area of quite a bit of passion for me, and when we have time for questions, I'll be glad to go back, but at least perhaps that'll give you a little idea of the perspective that I'm coming from in talking about how to make foster care better. It has to be in the broader context of how do we make child welfare better.
Thank you. Judge Richter?
So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I agree with everything that Commissioner Milner said, and have spent about 25 years of my life in child welfare in New York City, starting out as a lawyer representing children. And there are just a few things that I will add. As you heard, I have started out representing children, and I think that it's important to think about the fact that our system obviously is administered by adults. Caseworkers are adults, albeit sometimes relatively young ones. Our judges are adults, the lawyers are adults, and children are not. Their sense of time is entirely different than adults. And so the governor was talking about 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. A case can take a year or 2 or 3 to get through the family court. It can take 3 years in Kentucky to get adopted. If you're 4 years old, that is 3/4 of your life. And the need to have a sense of urgency about the work that we do is critical and often lost on those of us who do this work. And that is critically important when we think about our work. If I could change anything about the system that I've worked in, it would be figuring out how to keep the family court open during the hours when families are actually available to have their cases heard. I worked in the New York City Family Court where we opened at 9:30 and we closed at 4:30, and we had an hour for lunch, and I had about 800 cases. So no one really ever got justice. And that's a problem. I would also add that when I started as a lawyer in New York City, there were about 50,000 children in foster care, and today there are about 9,000 children in foster care. In 1990, there were about 35% of those 50,000 children in congregate or institutional care. Today in New York City, less than 10% of children are in institutional congregate care. That is progress in child welfare. And that's because we use real preventive services. We haven't gotten to the point yet where we're using primary preventive, but we have shifted the way we do our work so that children, whenever possible, and we hope whenever safe, can be with their families, because we have learned that when children come into the system, it takes us so long to figure out what to do with them, and we struggle so much as adults who want to believe other adults that we never let go of those children. And so they sit in care while we think about it. And so we have invested a lot of money in New York in preventive services that we think work, and we haven't seen a dramatic increase in repeat maltreatment while we've done that. And I think that's really important. So while the country is now experiencing an increase of 10% in foster care, New York City is not. New York City is not. New York State is, but New York City is not. And that's because we've spent a lot of money on really expensive prevention for our children and families. I agree with Commissioner Milner. You are always going to have families that have to have their kids removed. The governor talked about the horrible burn cases and the horrible dog cases. You are always going to have those cases. They cannot drive child welfare policy. They shouldn't drive child welfare policy. At the end of the day, we all have families. None of them are perfect. None of them will ever be perfect. The notion that because a parent is incarcerated, all of that family have significant enough problems that the children should just come into care is frankly misguided. Families need opportunities, and they are not going to be provided by any child welfare system. They're going to be provided by communities, economies, commerce, education. And so I'll leave it at that to say that for far too long, we have all, across this country, depended on the child welfare system as though it was going to be the answer. The child welfare system is an ambulance, much like the emergency room. We think way too highly of it. And as everyone has said, it's never been funded to create opportunities for families or to address poverty.
Thank you. Professor Wilson?
I saw some folks who wanted to clap. I've been wanting to clap after every single speaker. I don't know how to turn this on, so hopefully I get rescued. I did turn it on. I don't know how to advance it. So I apologize. I'm going to read, unlike my professional colleagues here, because this is some new work for me. But I want to talk about what I think is a gathering cloud over pieces of the system that make the system work. And that in particular are the adoption and social services agencies right now. And I want to suggest to you that we are seeing at this moment the leading edge of a culture war. And we've seen 3 skirmishes in the last week. In Texas, a lesbian couple filed suit against an agency that would not consider them as foster parents for refugee children who were in need of a home, because they did not mirror the Holy Family. Now, this is not the kind of foster care issue and adoption issue that we have been talking about so far. But the pieces of this system have to be there in order for the entire child welfare, for the ambulance to deliver that patient. Now, ironically, as you'll see on this map, Texas passed standalone legislation last year that allows adoption agencies to make placements consistent with their faith. 1 in 10 states explicitly say that social services agencies, foster and adoption, can follow their faith in placement. But that Texas legislation proved irrelevant because this program is supported by federal dollars. And on January 11th of last year, 2017, provisions that were made final in the closing hours of the Obama administration became effective. And they say that no one receiving federal grants can discriminate against beneficiaries or participants in those programs on a whole range of bases, including race, including religion, but now including sexual orientation and gender identity. And that rule was precipitated by the Obergefell and the Windsor decisions out of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, as an adopted child, I want to be sure that every family that is willing to care for children can step up and do that. In fact, gay families, single women, lots of folks who don't fit in many minds a perfect form, they've been stepping up to adopt lots and lots of children who otherwise would not have homes. So the second skirmish, South Carolina. A religious foster care agency, one of the largest in the state, is now negotiating with the State Department of Social Services, which in 2017 interpreted this specific regulation as barring that agency from recruiting only families that practice that agency's religion, i.e. they wanted Christian families because they're a Christian agency. The department gave the Social Services Agency a 30-day ultimatum. You place children without regard to your religious mission, or we're going to yank your license. South Carolina's governor now has stepped in to ask HHS for a waiver. And the third skirmish, Georgia. Last week, the Keep Faith in Adoption and Foster Care Act passed the Georgia Senate. with the hopes, as Senator Ligon, the sponsor, says, of keeping open as many doors as possible for those children that are in need of homes. Now, in Georgia, at least 8 of Georgia's 98 adoption agencies are faith-based, and likely not to make a placement with same-sex couples because it would not be consistent with their faith tenets. Now, in the past, agencies faced with making placements inconsistent with their faith tenets have closed. You know, Catholic Charities of Boston is but one example, though. Now, critics of the bill have called Senator Ligon's bill a message of hate, said that it's bigoted, that it's a slap in the face to same-sex couples, that it sanctions discrimination. Now, ironically, if you see this map, no Georgia law would have required a placement inconsistent with that agency's faith. And the state law cannot push aside that federal requirement in regulation as to a federally funded program. And this map, if it shows anything, shows that the United States has become a mess of laws that are working in different directions. Some states, the bumpy ones, ban discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. But not all treat adoption agencies or foster care programs as public accommodations. Some states have heightened scrutiny for burdens on religious belief or practice in their state constitution or in state statutes like a Religious Freedom Restoration Act that mirror the federal RFRA. And so you can see litigation brewing just by looking at this map to defend the ability of agencies to make faith-guided placements. Some states have specific adoption protections. Some are pretty sophisticated. They make referrals between agencies when a family or a child is not being served. Some do not. Now, that kind of device is incredibly important in muting the harm and to avoiding the indignity of being turned away. Some states tie the ability to follow one's faith to not receiving public money, i.e. public money, public rules, just as the federal regulation essentially does. Interestingly enough, Alabama said public money, public rules. That's a bellwether. Now, in this growing tangle of laws, I think the thing that should matter the most is getting lost. Every child deserves the promise of a permanent, loving family. But our background laws are delivering win-lose answers. Requirements that agencies serve everyone, knowing that whole bunches of them are going to close. In some states, as many as 25%. Other win-lose answers, saying that laws saying agencies can turn away families, knowing that some of those folks are going to be so discouraged by that they may never adopt or take a child into care. And I can't imagine for myself the kind of hurt that my family, my mother and father, would have experienced if they had been turned away when they showed up to adopt me and my sister. So I actually think we need to start over and write a new script. And that script should have 2 principles. 1, every child deserves a loving, permanent family. And every loving family that wants to adopt should be able to do so without impediment. So what would that look like? Actually, that would look like an old script that we have right now around childhood development. We do precisely this sort of thing with early childhood development for poor, low-income families. We allow that family to decide who best serves their child's needs, and they match themselves to the agency that would best help them. So I'll stop right here by saying our system right now is picking winners and losers. The state is deciding which agencies to contract with and which to shower funds on. But we should place families in the driver's seat. The family should be able to decide what agency best serves them to make this incredible gift to children. And I think then, and only then, will we have taken children out of the culture war where they do not belong.
Thank you. I wanted to continue our conversation by picking up on something Judge Richter said, if he'll permit me to play devil's advocate for a minute. After these stories you heard from Governor Bevin about these horrific cases of child abuse, Judge Richter said he didn't think that those are the cases that should be driving child welfare. I think that's an accurate quote. What are the child welfare policy? What are the cases that should be driving child welfare policy? Who should we have in mind when we are thinking about all of these issues? And I want to open that up to all three of you because I think it might get us a little further in this conversation.
So I'll start briefly by saying that in New York City there are about 60,000 calls to the state central registry every year reporting allegations of abuse and neglect, and I think the indication rate is probably about 40%, so there's some finding of maltreatment within 60 days of the call. And I would say that what you're generally finding is some combination of substance misuse, family violence, and untreated, I don't want to exaggerate by saying mental illness, but some sort of emotional challenge that the family is, usually a mother, struggling with managing to provide adequate supervision to her children. There are no physical abuse, the children are not physically injured, but there is indicia that the parent is having a hard time adequately supervising the children. That and I certainly would want the commissioner or the professor to chime in here, but the overwhelming number of cases are not abuse cases, are not sexual abuse cases, do not contain burns. I would say that when I was a judge in a child protective part, maybe 8% or 7% of my cases were actually filed as abuse cases.
Sure, and I'm going to take the governor's advice and think outside the box and think a little less traditionally, which challenges, I think, the field of child welfare, which is not just the Child Welfare Agency. Let me be very clear. I see the whole legal judicial community, the array of service providers, other agencies that affect the lives of children and families as being just as much a part of the child welfare system as what we call the Child Welfare Agency. And I think what should drive that is a re-envisioning of what we're out there to accomplish on behalf of all families and children. The very best models that I'm seeing, and I am committing myself to trotting through as many of those states on your map there as possible, to see programs that are actually working. The programs that are having an effect are the ones that are providing universal family strengthening services to communities, as the judge has noted, so that those kinds of supports are there to prevent children and their families from coming into the more formal child protection system. If we're not driven by the needs of all families to have the basic protective capacity that will prevent children from being abused and neglected, then we're constantly going to be chasing our tails. If we wait until something bad happens, which is how we define child welfare right now, as I've said earlier, it's so very, very difficult to pick up those pieces. The governor himself gave an example that's not unlike many of the children that I worked with myself as a foster care worker, who come into the system so seriously traumatized that we're not able to get past that. And what happens is that trauma gets piled on in many ways through the foster care system, sometimes through moves, through not getting services, through severing of relationships that are critical to their mental, physical, emotional, psychological development. And then they get into some high-end treatment facility and really lose the opportunity then there to enjoy the benefits of a family, whether it's their own family or another family. We have to stop that. Otherwise, we're just constantly coming in after the fact. And I think if we're serious about primary prevention, and I'll preface that by saying I don't think we are, our funding sure as heck is not, our programs, our policies are not, but we have to think about preventing it for any one of us who might come to the attention. So I think the needs of families up front, before child welfare becomes involved, should be the thing that drives our work. And that's huge, and I don't expect everybody to agree with me on it, but I'm going to keep saying it.
You want to weigh in on this? Or?
I'll just say just a little bit. I think we're going to be very quickly self-defeating if we take this system and we make it sort of ground zero for the culture war. We cannot have people of faith walking away from this system. They're taking too much of their laboring ore here. We cannot have families that want to give children homes discouraged by being turned away from agencies. Now, I don't necessarily believe those families always have access issues. These are sometimes information problems about where is the agency that would serve you. But we need to empower families to be able to take the supports that the government is giving for making those connections to children permanently and put them in the driver's seat. Because right now, it feels bad. It's probably not unconstitutional for someone to take government money from everyone and not serve everyone, but it's not a good look. So we have got to find a better way for allocating that important government resource. And it should go to the families and the children who are the ultimate beneficiaries of all of this, and not specifically to agencies. Otherwise, the pressure will continue for every agency that takes dollars to serve every family. And that's unsustainable too.
I just wanted to ask one, maybe this will be the lightning round because we want to turn it over to the audience soon. But if you could pick, you mentioned, for instance, the way family court operates and the short hours and the inefficiencies, perhaps. In terms of finding families, I understand that this is not on the prevention end, but assuming that we will always be in need of families to take these most vulnerable kids in and the kids who are in the worst positions. What are the things that, I hate to think about it this way, but in terms of the customer experience, if you are a foster family, what are the things that you think could make that experience such that we would attract the best, sort of the most qualified, the most devoted, most stable families to that role? What could we change in their experience to improve that?
I'm happy to jump in. And I also think that requires a redefinition of what we're expecting out of foster families. Again, I feel compelled to qualify and say that in many situations, foster care does have to serve as a substitute for parents. I do not believe that is the most typical situation, and I think we have to somehow attract foster families who understand that foster care can be a support for families, not just a substitute for parents. And while that may be intimidating for many foster families, and it defies the kind of keep the birth parents and the foster parents separated mentality that has often characterized our foster care system, the foster parents that I've talked with and that I know and that I've watched doing their work are able to get tremendous satisfaction out of supporting the kind of permanency, the kind of stability, the kind of well-being that can rarely be accomplished outside of that child's relationship with their families. And I think we have to look for foster families that understand those dynamics, that are willing to support that level of engagement and involvement, as opposed to many of our attempts to recruit foster families that frankly is based on a rescue philosophy that I'm going to go out and I'm going to take this poor little kid away from those terrible parents. I do believe that many of those foster parents who come into it with that philosophy get very, very frustrated, particularly when reunification is there and when adoption is not a possibility. So I think we have to attract foster parents whose motivations, whose interests, whose capacities are largely different.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that at least in New York, where I'm very familiar with the laws and the regulations, there has to be a complete overhaul of how we regulate the foster parent experience. Right now, it is so challenging to foster that basically you can't have a job and be a foster parent. Once a child is placed with you, the next 2 to 3 weeks of your life is completely turned upside down. If you were, for example, a school teacher and it wasn't vacation and a child were placed in your home, you would have to take off 2 weeks of school in order to produce the child for their lawyer, their doctor, their social worker, in order to go to court. We have made it so unappealing to foster children in New York that we would have to just erase the regulations and start again. So to answer your question, we would have to completely change the way we regulate fostering. And I am almost positive that there isn't a state in the union that isn't pretty much the same, because we derive our regulations from the federal government. And so down to what kind of screens you have in your home, we have regulated fostering. So we've encouraged it to be a way to, unfortunately, earn money, even if that isn't why people come to it.
Robin, do you have any?
I'll just say a little bit more about the importance of faith communities. You have folks who are willing to do so much good in the world. We cannot afford for those communities to walk away from this important social support. Now, we have had closures, like Catholic Charities of Boston, and many folks believed that that was just sort of temporary dislocation. In other words, well, Catholic Charities won't do this work, so somebody else will come into that void and we can sustain that. That may be true on a limited scale, Boston. It might be true in a handful of states. It will not be true across all of the United States. Simply too much of that load being shouldered. And I'll give you a good example about how unfortunate this is in being bound up with the sort of question of LGBT rights, okay? And just so you understand my priors, I want those gay families adopting, absolutely. Lots of people I work with wouldn't be able to say that part of the sentence. They do think that these agencies should be doing this work. But when we tie those issues, sometimes we will say that these adoption agencies should close. That happened in Utah, which gave protections to the full LGBT community in housing and hiring. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to keep LDS family services in the adoption business. That was not possible. Now, I believe that there'll be some folks who, birth mothers, for example, that are more likely to do the very hard, difficult thing that my birth mother did and place a child with another family permanently, if they believe that that child will wind up in a faith community that makes sense to them. Or they can do that with an agency that they trust. And I think if we disrupt that, we're likely, as a whole community, a whole people, to lose. And I also think if we discourage those families that are stepping up, single women, gay couples, all kinds of families, we lose. So we have to get to a place where we don't have, in parts of this country, one of these solutions, and in the rest of this country, another solution.
Yeah. So we're going to open it up to questions now. There are some mics out there. Please, again, introduce yourself, and we would really prefer questions, not statements, about this topic. Thank you. Right here in the front. Just wait for the microphone there.
Hi, how are you? I'm here from Casa for Children of DC, court-appointed special advocates, and I'm really pleased to hear you speaking about prevention. I know DC Child Family Services has done a lot, and they've been calling it narrowing the gap. What I'm really interested to hear more about is the other side of it, prevention of recidivism, families that have reunified, and once the case closes with the family court, what additional supports can be provided to them as advocates when cases close. Sometimes it's very difficult to advocate for what we think is in the best interest of the children that the family may not have in their capabilities the opportunity to provide once those court supports and the social work supports leave. So what are your feelings on the recidivism prevention and the other side of that?
So I've got two people looking at me here. So. And I'm never shy. I should be. I'm going to answer it this way. I mentioned in my opening comments that if we're very serious about primary prevention, we need to look at ways in which those activities occur at the community level, where children and parents live. I've also said I think that those services, those kinds of supports need to be present for all families who live in a community, not just somebody that we deem to be at risk or who is at heightened risk for whatever reasons. If we could reimagine our child welfare system to be that family strengthening, community-based kind of system that exists, it isn't just something I'm dreaming up. I've been out there, I've seen it, and I can name the names of the agencies that are taking the lead in partnership with many others. If we create those kinds of environments, then when children are able to be back with their parents, they have the same access to that kind of ongoing family strengthening support that any other family would be there. The other thing that I will say about it is if we reimagine our foster care system to be more of a support for families than it is a routine substitute for parents. Once reunification is achieved, the foster parents themselves can be a support for those families. And again, this isn't something I'm laying awake at night dreaming up. I've actually been there to see this happening, where when the kids go home, the foster parents then are able to support those parents. So there are many different ways we can do that, and I don't think it always has to be the continuation of some evidence-based practice or some court-ordered service. Sometimes, yes, there, but it's not just one thing. And I think we really have to focus on creating the kinds of environments where families can thrive and get their needs met.
And this is happening. In other words, what the commissioner is describing is happening today. Obviously, there are children who go home and their foster parent and their parent maintain a relationship that is part of respite for that parent. I would also say that the more flexible the funding is, the movement in the direction that we see with Families First is exactly what we need to be able to support families after they go home, after the actual child welfare crisis is resolved. And the more we think about that, the more we can address exactly what you're describing. I also think it's really important to think about school and schools as being part of children's and families' safety net. There was a time when families relied on schools to help them out, and we need to re-envision the role that schools play in our communities to help families when they're struggling.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Lauren Conkle. I'm with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. Governor Bevin mentioned that his family, when they had 5 or 6 children, were denied from being able to adopt more because of the size of their family. I am the oldest of 10, and 5 of my siblings are adopted. Can you speak to some of the barriers that come with a large family wanting to increase the size of their family through adoption or foster care, and either how we evaluate that or how we could better speak to the proper responsibility of that family and their ableness to foster if they already do have a large number in their household?
You guys can start out with that one.
So, there are regulations that are in place that do have certain requirements, your question makes me think of one of my favorite judges who used to sit in the Bronx, who always complained about how, in heaven's name, this foster mother can have 10 children in her home. She's got 5 kids of her own, and then some agency put 5 more children in her home, and now she's got 10 children in her home, and she's got a 3-bedroom apartment. And I was the commissioner at the time. Ron, how can that happen? So, it does happen. And sometimes it's because, she's the children's grandmother and she wanted to take care of the kids and we thought it was completely appropriate. So, so the answer is it depends. I think that, each case is evaluated based upon the capacity of the parent, and it sounds like the governor, I can't imagine why, was, there was probably a much more strict administration of the rule, but there should be flexibility, especially with kin. In New York, kin is broadly defined, and we have a lot more flexibility. States decide what the rule will be, and it depends on issues of space, issues of parents' availability, and all sorts of things. But it is less and less, a barrier. 10 is a lot if they're all, if it's 5 and 5. It depends.
And I would add that I think one of the barriers, again, goes back to decisions that get made in foster care, because so many of the situations where there's a large group of children being adopted or should be adopted together, they're brothers and sisters. Oftentimes in the foster care system, we split those brothers and sisters up for various reasons, maybe not out of just a desire to split some kids up. We don't have the foster home that'll accept 5 or 6 kids at the same time. And then what happens all the time in foster care is that the trauma of the removal, of the maltreatment, of the separation starts to send kids in different directions to different levels of care. And then all of a sudden, a few years down the road, when we decide these children should be free for adoption, in the system, we very often use the very circumstances that we have created for those children by traumatizing them further to justify not placing them for adoption together, to say, okay, well, they don't have a relationship with each other, or this child needs this and this child needs that, or this one's attached to this foster mother. And so we create, again, not because we sit around and plot to create it, but that's the way our system works. And then we use those very circumstances to keep children more permanently separated through the adoption experience. And I think we have to, that may not be the only reason, then certainly not the only barrier that's out there, but I don't think it's an insubstantial or insignificant barrier.
Naomi, I'll just say one little thing. I worked for a time with the Utah legislature on the Utah Compromise. One of the things that I was struck by in that process was just how large Mormon families are. So, most of the folks I worked with had 8 kids. If you had 6, you were underachieving. We've got to be really, really careful with the family size question, that we actually don't inadvertently discourage certain faith communities that tend, on average, to have larger families from stepping up to that role. And likewise, it's a very big issue in kin placement, because You know, with lots of families, you have lots of generations living in the same household. And if you use a hard household size, you're going to work against what could perhaps be the best possible placement for that child. So in all of these things, I think it has to be sort of contextualized. We need decision makers and social workers who are thinking not in black and white terms, but in what's best for that child.
Yes, over here.
Thank you. John Shimano with the Child Welfare League. It seems like every time we've talked about primary prevention or even intervention to prevent foster care, at least in Washington, it's always been at the same time taking the same money. Don't we really have to invest at the same time that we're trying to reduce these other placements?
I don't think it's either or. I think that, yes, if we have more money, we can do a lot more at times. The people that I'm talking to out there, I won't name their names, and not every single one of them, but some of the ones that are having the most success in creating those primary prevention kinds of community-based systems out there are saying to me, I'm not asking you for more money, I'm asking you for more flexibility with the money. And to create the kind of a foster care system that I'm talking about that is supportive of the family, that doesn't cost us any more money. It costs us some imagination, it costs us some commitment, it costs us expectation that is the way we will deliver our services and that we'll organize ourselves around it. But if we keep doing exactly the same thing that we're doing right now and just throw a hell of a lot more money at it, guess what we're going to get? Exactly the same results that we're getting right now, and maybe more of them. So I'm not willing to go out on a limb and say this has to be a very costly kind of reconceptualization of things, but it does have to be one that challenges our thinking about the way we spend our money and what kind of programs we want to operate.
I just want to add that I agree with Governor Bevin that there is across the country an undervalue of social workers, and that I have not gone to any program of any sort about child welfare where someone doesn't raise that they're underpaid and that we spend so much money on training in this business because there's such high turnover. And we do have to figure that out because it's ridiculous. And I think that it's fine if someone stays for 2-3 years, but that's not happening. I mean, more and more people are staying for 6-12 months. And that's just bad for families and bad for child welfare practice.
And I'll just say one point on a regulatory point. The regulation that I was speaking about is a good example. The primary thrust of it, non-discrimination, so that every family is able to adopt, absolutely right in my view. The downstream effect of it, though, is that's a regulation as the way I read it, as to the entire program, not only the piece that you receive those funds for. And in that sense, it's very different than the public money, public rules rule that was adopted in some states. Think Maryland in connection with its marriage equality law. It said religious adoption social services agencies before same-sex marriage, if they did a particular kind of placement, i.e. with traditional married families, they did it before, they can do it again. Okay, we talk about that sometimes as a religious liberty protection. It's not. It's sort of a preserve the status quo type thing. But that rule applied if you did not take funds in that program. This rule, as I read it, applies to the entire agency if you take any funds. And that's just, I think, an unintended consequence, to use the governor's term, of a well-meaning regulation. And I think we need to do an audit of our regulations to think about when they have spillover that wasn't what they were intended to do at all.
Maybe one more question, sorry, over here, and then we'll wrap things up.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Jacobs with Connect Our Kids. we are involved in designing technology supports for the child welfare system. Could you speak to the issue of software and technology? What is being used? How well is it or is it not supporting the system? And what would you envision that would be a role in which technology could better support the social workers and the system? Thank you.
We're in 1948.
Maybe we'll just take one answer on this. Since
Okay.
we're trying to wrap up. I don't mean to keep looking
So,
at you, but maybe Judge
I'm
Richter
from
has
New York, and we use something called Connections, CNNX, and I am not going to say
Such a
anything
cool
else
acronym, though.
because it's really, really bad. And anyone who works in child welfare in New York has nothing good to say about it, but we continue to pour gobs and gobs of money into it because we know we're going to get it right eventually. It's not child-friendly. You can't carry it around. It's a bunch of... See, I'm saying more about it because I'm just going to say more bad things about Connections.
I think it would be terrific if you could find a technology that connects parents to the children, right? So that every parent that wants to make this commitment is directed sort of seamlessly to an agency that matches with them. And if that's, a Christian family that wants a Christian agency, great. And if it's a gay couple that wants a gay-friendly agency, great. Right? Let's make this easy.
Anything to add, or you?
Data interoperability. Let me just throw that on the table. I think if we're gonna data sharing, and we can come up with a million reasons why that's impossible. Sometimes a perception of a law that frankly doesn't exist. But to be really about prevention, we have to link up with a lot of the data systems from a lot of other systems, healthcare, education, law enforcement, so many other pieces of the broader child and family serving system out there, the courts, obviously, there. So I won't go on and on, but I think about data sharing.
All right, well, maybe join me in thanking our distinguished panel today, and thank you all for coming out.